Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and when referring to the modern history of Central Africa, and most particularly to the history of Western imperialism in that region, it has become so customary to refer to Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel, Heart of Darkness, that it's practically a tedious cliché.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
That said, no one's ever accused me of being a stunningly original thinker. And maybe Conrad's book has become such a touchstone because it hits on something important about the process of Western imperialism in Africa. In this relentlessly grim story, the protagonist Marlowe undertakes a harrowing journey up the Congo River, encountering scenes of degradation and brutality at every stop along the way. The climax comes as he encounters Kurtz, a man who supposedly came to Africa to help out its inhabitants, but who was driven mad by the circumstances that he found there. As evidence of his descent into insanity, he had scrawled the words, "Exterminate all the brutes," across a written account of his plan to bring civilization to Africa.
Exterminate them! Exterminate them! Exterminate them!
But how true was it? Was Conrad's portrayal of a high-minded civilizing mission, which was ultimately corrupted into capitalist greed, terror, and atrocity, really accurate? Or are all these lurid tales of imperialism in the Congo just BS? Well, let's dig into it a bit. So one thing to establish right from the start is, however critical it might be of the process of European imperialism in Africa, Conrad's account has long been criticized for its racist portrayal of Africa and Africans. Indeed, he describes Africa as hopeless and dark, impenetrable to human thought, and pitiless to human weakness. No less a literary luminary than the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe was appalled when he encountered Conrad's book, and was largely inspired to write his own 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart, which went on to become one of the most celebrated works of the past 100 years, in part as a response. In it, he portrays the indigenous African culture of the Igbo people as something that was vibrant and sophisticated long before the white guys showed up, as a deliberate contrast to Conrad's portrayal of Africans as brutish, animalistic, and childlike, passive objects that were acted upon by Western imperialism.
And Africa's story, of course, had been told by European writers.
Yes, a whole tradition of storytelling was created simply to tell the story of Africa. And the reason for that is not very far from the reason for the slave trade, because it's as deep as that, to present a people's story in such a way as to make them look bad.
Obviously, Achebe was a brilliant guy, so I think we can have a fair amount of confidence in his ability to recognize racism when he sees it. Let's just take it as a given that there is a certain amount of racism layered into Conrad's account of imperialism in the Congo. That said, I think that Conrad's book really does function primarily as a very harsh critique of what Europeans were doing. Indeed, however bad indigenous Africans come off in his account, the Europeans are undeniably worse. So how about that? Was that accurate?
We have such sights to show you.
To start off with, in the early modern period, the Congo River Basin was one of the well springs of the Atlantic slave trade. You had Portuguese and later Dutch, English, and French slave traders cutting deals with local political leaders to round up and transport captives to be used as slave labor across the Atlantic. That trade transported millions of human beings away from their homes over the course of several centuries, and has to be taken as something that left a deep scar on African culture. If we're talking about active colonialism in the Congo, though, that's more of a late 19th century story. The key player when it came to carving out a colony in Central Africa along the Congo River was tiny Belgium. And indeed, not just Belgium, but one man, the King of Belgium, a guy named Leopold II, who, among his good qualities, well, pretty much the only one was that he had a strong beard game, which clearly is something that I can appreciate, right? But, a genuine eccentric and weirdo, like he was a hypochondriac, he was paranoid about getting sick. When it was wet outside, he had a special bag that he put his beard in to keep it from getting wet, strange stuff like that, which is neither here nor there. When it came to his foreign policy, though, the effects of what he did in Africa would ultimately claim the lives of millions of people. He was largely responsible for carving out what became known as the Congo Free State, one of the more misleading labels in all of modern history. It was established in 1885, largely with the assistance of a guy named Henry Morton Stanley. He was an American journalist and explorer, and was employed by Leopold II to begin negotiating a series of treaties, ultimately with some 400 local leaders in Central Africa who were largely swindled into signing away sovereignty over their territory and kind of handing that over to Leopold II. This Congo Free State that was created out of that process was some 75 times larger than wee Belgium was back in Europe, with many times the population. It was pitched to the world as a great civilizing mission. The flag of the Congo Free State was a blue field with a yellow star on it, representing kind of the dawn of white Western Christian civilization that was supposedly going to uplift and enlighten the benighted savages of Africa. It was also described as being a measure to try and counteract the slave trade, which was waning by the late 1800s, what was still something of a thing. So, in terms of public relations, the Congo Free State was supposed to be a humanitarian enterprise. The reality, though, was quite different, that it ended up being kind of the personal feudal fief of Leopold II. Like, it was his land. It did not belong to Belgium. And he signed out a series of kind of subcontracts with various companies to exploit its economic resources. The first major commodity from the Congo was elephant ivory, which was harvested from throughout the region. But eventually the biggest one was rubber. This was the dawn of the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, where you had all sorts of innovations back in Europe in terms of electronics, the internal combustion engine, and rubber was used as coating for wires or in pneumatic tires or in a whole host of other things. It was a very, very valuable commodity, and at this point in history, it largely came from harvesting the sap of certain vines that grew throughout the tropics, not just in Africa, but also, in Amazonia in South America, as well as in the Dutch colonies that would eventually become Indonesia. Obviously, these resources are one thing, but you need labor to really harvest it. And obviously, the labor came from the indigenous populations, which were brutalized into meeting the economic needs of these companies that were involved in the Congo Free State. As a means of enforcing these production quotas, you had the so-called force publique, which was largely staffed by indigenous members who were recruited as young children and trained to serve under white Belgian officers, and who used violence and terror to compel adherence to this system of commodity exploitation. The deal was that the inhabitants of every particular sub-region within the Congo Free State had a certain production quota that they were responsible for meeting. Often these were very, very ambitious. They were designed to meet the sort of desire for capitalistic profits of the companies rather than anything that was sustainable. Often it actually resulted in the destruction of the rubber vines that were producing the sap for the commodity. But in essence, rubber collection was extracted under the threats of violence, that if people did not meet their quotas, they could be brutally beaten, their families could be tortured or murdered. You had plenty of examples of people whose hands were simply chopped off if they did not sufficiently produce. The force publique became notorious for using an implement called the chicotte, a whip made out of woven hippopotamus hide that was very, very tough. Very nasty implement that, if applied with sufficient vigor, could just absolutely flay the skin off of someone's back. So this is the sort of kind of nightmarish measures that the people working for Leopold II used to extract as much profit as they possibly could out of the Congo. Now, this wasn't quite slave labor in the sense that there were sometimes wages paid, but they tended to be extremely meager, but nothing even remotely approaching fair compensation for the sort of nightmarish conditions under which these individuals labored. And this was undertaken on such a scale that naturally there was going to be substantial outcry. One of the people who spearheaded this was an African-American journalist named George Washington Williams, who went over to observe what was going on in Congo, at first as an enthusiast for this sort of civilizing anti-slave trade mission that he thought it represented. But once he saw circumstances on the ground, he became determined to spread the news to the world of the sort of barbarism that was being practiced on a daily basis. He was one of the guys that actually first coined the phrase crime against humanity and used it to describe what was going on in the Congo Free State. Ultimately, there were also several other Western observers who got in on the act, publicizing the level of atrocity. Roger Casement, Edmund Morel also spoke out against what they saw going on in Congo. Eventually, this did prompt Leopold II to transfer control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government in 1908. But in doing so, he also destroyed all of the records from the archives of the Congo Free State and largely absconded with all of the profits that he earned. He died the next year worth more than $1 billion, and that's in early 20th century money. One of the richest individuals on earth. And while the situation might have improved somewhat under the management of the Belgian state, it was still very much a brutal and exploitative colony. Over the course of the Congo Free State's existence, perhaps upwards of 10 million people died. That might have been as much as 50% of the overall population, which means that this is one of the most grotesque examples of the brutality of Western imperialism in all of human history. It was bad everywhere. Nowhere was it worse than in Congo. And I wish I could tell you that stuff got better after that. Eventually, Belgium was forced to acknowledge the independence of Congo. In 1960, a charismatic dissident who had actually been imprisoned by the Belgians, Patrice Lumumba, became the first elected prime minister of an independent Congo state. He was a committed nationalist who was determined to secure control for the Congo over its own natural resources and to use them for the benefit of the people of Congo. And to that end, he found a great deal of resistance from all of the Western powers, particularly from the United States, that was certainly, by the 1960s, one of the dominant players in world politics. And given the new realities of the Cold War, resistance on the part of the Americans seemed likely to drive Lumumba into the arms of the Soviet Union for the sort of economic assistance he thought he needed to help develop his country's economy. Rather than allow that to happen, the CIA sponsored a number of plots against Lumumba's life. Ultimately, you saw a colonel from the Congolese army, a guy named Joseph Desire Mobutu, seize power, suspend constitutional rule. Lumumba was ultimately brutally beaten, tortured, his body hacked to pieces, and dissolved in a barrel of acid. Mobutu, or as he came to be known, Mobutu Sese Seko, would rule over Congo, which he rechristened Zaire, for the next several decades with something of an iron hand. He was no Democrat, but because of his firm anti-communism and his resolutely pro-American stance, he was a frequent guest in multiple American presidential administrations, even as he sanctioned a kleptocracy in Central Africa, which pillaged the region of its wealth and its natural resources. And again, all of this done with American support and assistance, and something to the tune of $1 billion American in aid money that flowed into Mobutu's government. In an odd parallel to Leopold II, when Mobutu died, he was worth more than $4 billion, again one of the richest men in the world. And even that did not mark an end to the misery of the region. Mobutu's death saw a series of brutal wars that were fought in Central Africa, often centered on the Congo, that raged over the course of the next decade. Between 3 and 4 million Congolese casualties. And that brings us to even today, where Congo continues to be exploited by foreign parties for its natural resources, this time mineral, particularly stuff like cobalt and a substance called coltan, which is used in cell phones and laptops and cameras and video equipment and stuff like that. So, most likely, if you have a phone, and who doesn't at this point, there is a better than even chance that some of the elements that are used there originally came from the Congo. All of these resources are essentially pillaged by multinational corporations. These days, even the Chinese are in on the act with their Road and Belt Initiative and their efforts to kind of exploit the local African economy. So one way or another, unfortunately, Congo is today in the early 21st century, much as it was in the late 19th century, an era where the inhabitants suffer under horrific violence and brutality, and whose labor is used to exploit the local resources for the profit of people abroad. Unfortunately, not a very happy story. Recommended sources, obviously we began with Conrad's 1899 novel, which, despite the racism that is interwoven throughout its narrative, remains a gripping and powerful piece of work. Also mentioned Chinua Achebe and his response to that. You could check out his 1958 Things Fall Apart, which is another great novel, one of the absolute classics of modern literature. You could also take a look at his essay from 1975, An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which takes on Conrad's book a bit more directly. For a readable scholarly account of the grim history of modern Congo, Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost from 1998 will give you that. I also recommend Jason Stearns' Dancing in the Glory of Monsters, The Collapse of the Congo and the Great War of Africa from 2012, as well as Tom Burgess's The Looting Machine, on the economic exploitation of Africa more generally over the course of the past generation or so. So for our verdict about whether these grisly stories about imperialist exploitation of Congo throughout the past several centuries are BS or not, obviously not. This is one of the most sobering cautionary tales of just how predatory and damaging the engines of modern capitalism can be, and a crystal clear illustration of just how much any pretense to a civilizing or uplifting Western imperialist mission in Africa was just a load of crap. Obviously and nakedly, this was about power and exploitation, and it represents one of the grimmer chapters in modern world history. That's all I got for you. Sorry it's been so grim, but, hopefully you've got a puppy to hug or something. Always check your sources and evidence. See you later.